It started on a Tuesday morning when I heard the familiar click-clack of Karen Henderson's sensible shoes marching up my driveway. As the self-appointed president of our Willowbrook Estates H.O.A., Karen had made it her personal mission to ensure that every blade of grass, every mailbox, and apparently now every front door met her exacting standards. I watched from my kitchen window as she approached my newly painted sage green door, clipboard in hand, her lips pursed in that particular way that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Karen's voice, sharp and authoritative. "Excuse me. Excuse me. I need to speak with you immediately about a serious violation of our community standards." She rapped her knuckles against my door frame, careful not to actually touch the offending green paint. When I opened the door, her eyes lit up with the kind of righteous indignation that only comes from finding someone else's harmless choice to complain about. "This door color is completely unacceptable. According to bylaw 47B from our original 1992 charter, all front doors in this community must be painted in approved neutral tones only." I'd been living in Willowbrook Estates for 3 years, and this was the first time anyone had mentioned anything about door colors. Half the neighborhood had colorful doors, deep blues, warm reds, even a cheerful yellow 2 houses down. But Karen had that look in her eyes, the one that said she'd found her new crusade, and nothing was going to stop her from making this everyone else's problem. "I'm sorry, Karen, but I checked all the current H.O.A. guidelines before painting my door. There's nothing in there about color restrictions." I kept my voice calm and professional, the tone I'd learned to use during my years working in corporate law before I'd made enough in tech investments to retire early at 38. Karen's I twitched slightly at my reasonable response, which I'd learned was usually a bad sign. Karen's voice, getting shriller. "The bylaw exists, and it's still valid. Just because it's not in the current handbook doesn't mean it's not enforceable. I've done my research, and I'm telling you that door needs to be repainted in an approved color within 72 hours, or you'll be facing fines." She thrust a copy of what looked like a very old, photocopied document at me. The paper was yellowed, and the text was barely legible, but sure enough, buried in subsection B of some ancient regulation, there was language about maintaining uniformity in exterior door treatments with approved earth tones only. Over the next few days, Karen went door to door, literally armed with her decades-old bylaw and a measuring tape. She documented every single non-neutral door in the neighborhood, taking photos and making notes, with the dedication of a crime scene investigator. The cheerful yellow door got a citation. The deep blue colonial revival got a warning. Even Mrs. Patterson's barely off-white cream door was deemed too bold and marked for violation. The neighborhood group chat exploded with complaints. People who had lived here for decades were suddenly being told their doors, which had been the same color for years, were violations. Karen had somehow convinced the current H.O.A. board, a group of well-meaning but easily intimidated neighbors, that this ancient bylaw superseded all common sense and decades of precedent. Karen's voice, smug and satisfied. "Rules are rules. I didn't write them, I just enforced them. If people wanted colorful doors, they should have moved to a neighborhood without standards. This is what happens when we let things slide for too long. One person gets away with a green door, and next thing you know, we'll have hot pink houses and lawn flamingos everywhere." I tried reasoning with her first, as I always do. I attended the emergency H.O.A. meeting she called, armed with documentation showing that the bylaw had been superseded by later amendments, that it hadn't been enforced in over 20 years, and that retroactively applying it could create legal liability for the association. But Karen had done her homework too, sort of. She'd found some obscure legal precedent about dormant covenants and had somehow convinced herself and the board that they were legally obligated to enforce this random rule she'd dug up. The meeting was a circus. Karen stood at the front of the community center, pointing at a PowerPoint presentation she clearly spent hours creating, complete with before and after photos of every offending door in the neighborhood. She'd even created a color chart showing the approved neutral tones, which seemed to consist exclusively of various shades of beige, brown, and white. "This isn't about being mean," she declared to the room full of increasingly angry neighbors. Karen's voice, defensive but determined. "This is about property values. This is about maintaining the character and standards that make Willowbrook Estates the prestigious community it is. When we let people do whatever they want, chaos follows." Mrs. Chen raised her hand from the back. "Karen, my red door has been red since 1995. Are you seriously telling me I need to repaint it because of some rule nobody's heard of?" The murmur of agreement that followed was unmistakable, but Karen just smiled that tight, condescending smile she'd perfected over years of neighborhood disputes. Karen's voice, patronizing. "I understand change is hard, Mrs. Chen, but rules are rules. The door color issue is just the beginning. Once we establish that our community standards matter, we can move on to other important issues, like those oversized garden gnomes in the Johnsons' front yard, and don't get me started on the Rodriguez family's wind chimes." That's when I knew this wasn't really about door colors at all. This was about Karen asserting her authority, proving that she could make an entire neighborhood bend to her will over something completely arbitrary. She tasted power and found she liked the way it felt to make people scramble to accommodate her demands. I spent the next week watching the neighborhood transform as people grudgingly began repainting their doors. The yellow became beige. The blue became taupe. Mrs. Patterson's cream became straight white. It was like watching the life slowly drain out of our street, one door at a time. But more than that, I watched Karen patrol the neighborhood every evening, clipboard in hand, documenting compliance with the satisfaction of someone who'd won a war. She started expanding her enforcement efforts, just as she promised. The garden gnomes got citations for non-conforming decorative elements. The wind chimes were deemed noise violations. She even measured the height of everyone's grass and issued warnings for anything over 2 3/4 inches. Karen had created her own little fiefdom, and she was ruling it with an iron fist wrapped in H.O.A. bylaws. But here's the thing about people like Karen, they always overplay their hand. And they never bother to really understand who they're dealing with before they start their campaigns of petty tyranny. Karen saw a quiet neighbor with a sage green door and assumed I'd be as easy to intimidate as everyone else. What she didn't know was that my early retirement had come from selling a legal tech startup to a major firm, leaving me with both the resources and the knowledge to play whatever game she wanted to start. More importantly, she didn't know that my former business partner was now a partner at one of the state's most prestigious law firms, specializing in property and municipal law, or that my college roommate had become a successful developer who'd built half the subdivisions in our county. Karen had picked a fight with someone who had both the means and the connections to fight back, but she was so drunk on her own authority that she never bothered to consider the possibility that her latest victim might not be a victim at all. The breaking point came 3 weeks later when Karen showed up at my door again, this time with what she claimed was a final notice about my door color. I'd deliberately not repainted it, partly out of principle, but mostly because I was curious to see how far she'd push things. The answer, apparently, was pretty far. Karen's voice, triumphant and nasty. "Since you refuse to comply with our community standards, the H.O.A. board has authorized me to arrange for your door to be repainted at your expense. We've hired a contractor, and the work will be completed this Friday. The cost of $450 will be added to your H.O.A. dues, along with a $200 administrative fee for non-compliance." She handed me an official-looking document that gave the H.O.A. permission to remedy violations on private property when owners fail to maintain community standards. It was exactly the kind of overreach I'd been expecting, and exactly the opening I'd been waiting for. Karen had just made the classic mistake of assuming that legal-sounding language was the same thing as legal authority. "Karen," I said, still maintaining that calm tone, "I don't think you have the authority to authorize work on my private property without my consent. That could be considered trespassing or property damage." But she just waved my objection away with the confidence of someone who'd been getting away with bullying her neighbors for so long that she'd forgotten there might be consequences. Karen's voice, dismissive. "The bylaws are clear. Community standards take precedence over individual preferences. If you don't like it, you can take it up with the board, but the decision is final. Your door will be beige by Friday afternoon." That Thursday night, I made some phone calls. The first was to my lawyer friend, who confirmed what I already suspected, that the H.O.A. had no legal authority to alter anyone's private property without proper legal process, and that their bylaw was almost certainly unenforceable given how long it had been dormant. The second call was to my developer friend, who had some very interesting information about Willowbrook Estates and its original planning documents. The third call was to a private investigator I'd worked with during my startup days, someone who specialized in property records and municipal research. By Friday morning, I had a complete picture of exactly what Karen had stepped into, and it was even better than I'd hoped. Because while Karen had been busy digging up obscure bylaws to torment her neighbors, she'd never bothered to research the full legal structure of our community. Friday arrived, and sure enough, a contractor showed up at my door with brushes and a gallon of beige paint. I politely explained that he didn't have permission to paint my property and suggested he contact whoever hired him to clarify the situation. Karen appeared within minutes, her face red with frustration at having her authority challenged so publicly. Karen's voice, losing her composure. "You can't stop this. The H.O.A. has voted, the decision is final, and your door is getting painted today whether you like it or not. I am so tired of dealing with people who think they're above the rules that keep this community functioning." "Actually, Karen," I said, pulling out my own folder of documents, "I think we need to have a conversation about rules. Because while you've been focused on that 1992 door color bylaw, I've been looking into some of the other original covenants that apparently still apply to our community." Her confident expression faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. Karen's voice, still defiant. "I don't know what you think you've found, but I've been researching community bylaws for months. There's nothing that changes the fact that your door is in violation and needs to be corrected." "Well," I continued, opening my folder, "let's talk about original covenant number 12 from the Willowbrook Estates founding documents. The one that establishes the community land trust and specifies that any property owner who attempts to enforce dormant covenants without proper legal authority forfeits their right to H.O.A. representation and may be subject to removal from any community leadership positions." Karen's face went pale, but she wasn't backing down yet. That's ridiculous. There's no such covenant. You're making that up to try to get out of following the rules like everyone else." "I'm not making anything up, Karen. In fact, let me read you the exact language." I pulled out a certified copy of the original community charter, complete with county clerk stamps and authentication. "Any resident who attempts to enforce community standards through coercion, intimidation, or unauthorized property modification shall be deemed to have violated the good faith provisions of community membership and may be subject to removal from all H.O.A. positions and committees." I watched as the color drained completely from Karen's face. She grabbed for the document, scanning it frantically, looking for some way to dismiss what she was reading. But there it was, in black and white, in the same 1992 charter she'd been using to justify her door color crusade. But that doesn't apply here," she stammered. Karen's voice, desperate now. "I'm not coercing anyone. I'm just enforcing legitimate community standards. The board voted on this. It's all completely legal. Actually, Karen, that brings us to the really interesting part. I pulled out another document, this one from the county recorder's office. See, while you were busy playing H.O.A. president, I did some research into the actual legal structure of Willowbrook Estates. And it turns out that our community was established as a limited equity housing cooperative, not a traditional H.O.A. Karen stared at me blankly. She clearly had no idea what that meant, but I could see the fear starting to creep into her eyes as she realized that all her research might have been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of our community's legal status. What that means, I continued, is that the enforcement mechanisms you've been using, the fines, the threats, the unauthorized contractor work, all of that is not just wrong, it's potentially illegal. Because in a limited equity cooperative, community decisions have to be made through a completely different process, one that requires actual member voting, not just board approval. I pulled out the third document in my folder, a letter from my lawyer friend's firm addressed to the Willowbrook Estates Board of Directors. This is a formal legal notice that the recent door color enforcement actions were conducted without proper authority and may constitute harassment and property damage. It also requests a full audit of all H.O.A. enforcement actions taken over the past 6 months. But I wasn't done yet. The fourth document was the one I'd been saving for last, the piece de resistance that would turn Karen's own weapon against her. And this, Karen, is a formal complaint filed with the county about your violations of the original Willowbrook Estates covenants. Her hands were shaking now as she took the document. My violations? I haven't violated anything. I've been following the rules exactly as they're written. Well, that's where things get interesting, I said, maintaining that same calm tone even as I prepared to deliver the knockout blow. You see, while you were so focused on everyone else's door colors, you missed a few important details about your own property. Specifically, Original Covenant 15, which requires all H.O.A. board members to maintain their properties in strict compliance with every single community standard, including ones that might not be regularly enforced. Karen's face went white as she realized where this was going. Your house, Karen, has a decorative shutters that are painted forest green. Forest green isn't on your approved neutral color list. According to your own interpretation of the bylaws, you've been in violation the entire time you've been president. And according to the original covenants, that violation automatically disqualifies you from holding any leadership position in the community. But I still wasn't finished. Oh, and there's one more thing. Remember how you said that enforcing dormant covenants was so important for maintaining community standards? Well, I found another dormant covenant that I think you'll find very interesting. Original Covenant 23 establishes that any community member who uses their position to selectively enforce rules for personal gain or harassment can be required to sell their property and leave the community within 90 days. Karen dropped the documents, her clipboard clattering to the ground. Karen's voice, barely a whisper. You can't do this. I was just trying to maintain standards. I was just doing what was best for the community. And the best part, I continued, is that I've already filed a formal petition with the county to have Covenant 23 enforced. See, it turns out that when you establish a pattern of selective enforcement and harassment, as you've done over the past month, other community members have the right to invoke the original community protection provisions. I pulled out one final document, the one that I knew would end this entire charade once and for all. This is a purchase agreement for your property, Karen. A cash offer at 15% above market value, contingent on you accepting a voluntary departure from the community within 30 days. Because while Covenant 23 gives me the legal right to force you out, I'd rather give you the option to leave with dignity and a nice profit. Karen stared at the purchase agreement, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She'd spent so much energy trying to control everyone else that she'd never considered the possibility that someone might turn her own tactics against her, with interest. "The offer expires at 5 p.m. today," I said, checking my watch. "After that, we proceed with the formal covenant enforcement process, which will likely take 3 to 6 months and won't include any financial compensation for your departure. Your choice." As the full scope of what I'd done began to sink in, Karen's face went through a remarkable transformation. The righteous indignation melted away, replaced by shock, then disbelief, then finally a kind of hollow recognition that she'd been completely and thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone who'd played her own game better than she ever could. Karen's voice stunned. You planned this. You let me dig myself in deeper just so you could. So I could protect my neighbors from a bully who was using made-up authority to make everyone miserable," I finished. "Yes, Karen. That's exactly what I did. You wanted to play the bylaw game, so I played it. The only difference is that I actually read all the bylaws, not just the ones that gave me power over other people." Karen stood there in my driveway, surrounded by the scattered papers that represented the complete collapse of her little reign of terror, finally understanding that her victim had never been a victim at all, just someone with the patience to let her hang herself with her own rope.